Art is a reflection of society is like one of the first things you learn when talking about art history. The only thing you might learn before that is that art is irrevocably a human creation. The society this phrase is referring to is the blanket term meant to describe the conditions which dictate human existence. It is the culmination of the social, cultural, economic, or political conditions of a certain time period which is relevant to the art. All art created under a certain society either depicts certain aspects of that society or are a result of that certain society, irregardless of artist intent. Ergo, after their surrender to the Allies in World War II, Japan would go through many changes. The population would start to heavily skew anti-war, the result of the imperialist efforts of the 20s and 30s, as well as the gruesome results of World War II, left the citizens averse to conflict. This focused the attention of the population on internal affairs, as rebuilding the country was a priority for those who had lost homes, family members, and friends. At the same time, the United States would begin to occupy Japanese land, which would lead to the creation of a new constitution under the watchful eye of said occupying force. This new constitution was a liberal democracy, a contrast to their previous Meiji constitution, which led to the rise of the Japanese Empire and its imperialist efforts. A few years later, Japan would sign two post-war treaties: the Security Treaty between the United States and Japan, and the Treaty of San Francisco. The Treaty of San Francisco sought to end the war taking place in Asia, mainly being perpetrated by the Empire of Japan's imperialist efforts of China and Korea. The treaty made Japan recognize Korean independence, forced them to leave the territories that they had taken, and had Japan pay reparations to the affected countries. But that's only a few sections in the treaty, as the other articles are focused around economic and political relations within the Allied nations, specifically Article 12 and 13, which focused on trading and maritime rights, as well as air transportation rights, both commercial and industrial. Shifts in the population's thinking towards anti-war and anti-imperialist sentiment, access to communication with governmental bodies through the democratic process, along with access to international trade within the Treaty of San Francisco, were the keys to starting the fastest growing economy in the modern world. For the next 20 years, the country focused heavily on creating well thought out and citizen-first infrastructure that prioritized the well-being of the average citizen. They focused on building a strong public education system that is not without flaw, but was consistent enough to create a country with some of the largest and easiest access to post-secondary education attainment. They built comprehensive public transport systems to make moving around an ever-growing city much easier, built diverse housing which allowed for a variety of different housing options, thus lowering the cost of living, and fortified older neighborhoods and buildings to preserve culture. This massive internal growth was being supported by Japan's increase in international trade, and them becoming a leader in product development and innovation, another field that was growing rapidly. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, the country had made its mark as an economic superpower, strong enough to rival that of the United States and USSR. As time went on, that rapid growth started to slow down due to some form of diminishing returns, but they were still growing at a rate unlike any other country at the time and since. Some hiccups through the 70s caused by the energy crisis meant that Japan was forced to change their economic stronghold of product development to technology development. They quickly became a major player in technological advancements, in particular in the automotive industry, where the Toyota Corolla would become the best-selling car for multiple years in a row, alongside the sales of other incredibly successful brands like Honda and Mazda. This was also the time of economic strength that allowed for the growth of entertainment. Anime and manga saw massive rises in creation and sales as economic security allowed for individuals to take up artistic hobbies, or feel better about joining the less stable field of art. This was also the rise of Nintendo, a company that had shifted its focus to at-home entertainment to massive success, with singular systems from the Game & Watch family, as well as the thing that made at-home gaming possible, the Famicom. People were very ready to wave their cash around to anything that interested them, and for the longest time, it seemed like Japan was going to be unstoppable. Until it was stopped. A market crash in 1991, caused by the bursting of the asset price bubble, halted the entire economy. Political actions that sought to bandage the economy were not effective enough to stop the spread of the crash. Ineffective systems that were meant to rebuild the economy in a quick and effective way only prolonged the healing process. A growing unemployment rate, less people seeking higher education, and an overall more monetarily strict lifestyle meant that depression hit a record high. Companies could no longer afford to hold on to employees as they cost too much. New hires were only brought on for temporary positions that wielded lower wages than any stable jobs. This put a strain on corporations who still needed to make revenue at the end of every quarter. This meant that an increasingly large amount of work had to be completed by a decreasingly small amount of people. Even 20 years after the crash was still affecting the livelihood of every person in Japan. And it stayed like that. I am not a great writer, which means I like offloading most of my content onto the viewers, leading me to ask questions like, what is Isekai, without ever having to give a definitive answer. So then, what is Isekai? Or more specifically, what is the conflict of Isekai? Each style or genre of narrative tends to follow a very small list of conflicts that are to be fleshed out or resolved within their respective narratives. Romance has about 2, maybe 3 conflicts. One is the conflict of becoming a couple, another is the difficulties of being a couple. It's not all-encompassing, but most romance has a variation of those conflicts intersecting with the conflicts and goals of other genres. A rom-com, for example, is a style of comedy brought on by the conflict of being a couple. Or becoming a couple, sorry. Isekai has only one conflict, and it's dealing with being in a fantasy world. But that can be stripped back a little more, because while yes, it's dealing with the difficulties of living in a fantasy world, it's more accurate to say that it's the difficulty of losing normalcy. Things like family, friends, comfortability, their house, everything you associate with regular life has been stripped away from them, and they now have to figure it out. They might not fit in, they have to adjust to the social norms of this new world and find a way to live comfortably, if at all. That is the conflict of Isekai. With that said, that lays up a very clear end goal to this conflict, as the resolution to this new problem is to return to their normal life. Through the journey to return to normalcy, they can learn things about themselves or the world around them to better help their life going forward. It might make them appreciate the normal life they used to live more, or open their eyes to injustices that happen everywhere, with the final goal of achieving a way home. Finally, returning to their normal, comfortable life. Of course, there's a chance that normal has changed during the story. They might not be able to return, or they might bring an alien species with them, but they find a new normal, somewhere they can call home. And hey, look, we've just completed the hero's journey. But that first conflict, losing normality, regardless of if it can be solved wholly or be compromised with, must be present in order to progress this story. Love a good taquito. The main character has to want to achieve the goal of returning to their normal. As well, that main goal must be achievable in order to create a good story. A character has to hold on to the hope that they can return to their old life in order to have constant tension in the story and an end goal to work towards. But that creates an interesting dynamic about what exactly is normal and abnormal. You see, for this style of story to work, it requires the normal that the main character has been taken from and they are trying to return to is worth returning to. But that also kind of means the inverse, that the abnormal, which the main character has been taken to and is trying to escape from, must be worth escaping from. The tension brought on by the conflict of Isekai can hold strong through a story because you can see the light at the end of this horrifying tunnel that is the return to normal life. But that conflict starts looking less like a conflict as the dynamic between normal and abnormal changes. Just humor me for a second. What if normal life just sucked? Normal does not always imply good. It's just normal. Which also means that living in very bad conditions, being depressed or worse abused by a person or system can be normal for some people. Conversely, abnormal does not always imply bad. It's just different. If the normal sucks, the conflict of wanting to return to that normal is no longer present. If the normal sucks, removing the main character from it can be seen as a good thing. If the normal sucks, you can kill your main character. At around the same time the Japanese economy crashed, there was a technology being developed that changed everyone's lives named the the internet. Japan was relatively late to the party when it came to the internet, partly because of the aforementioned crash, but also because they lived on the other side of the world. The internet was being researched in the United States as early as the 60s. Japan wouldn't start the same process until 1984. The project would start under two people: Jun Murai, a professor at Keio University, and Hideki Tsunohara, a student of Murai's turned researcher. These two met and started working together under the same lab between the years of 1982 and 1984, where they would research and study digital network technology. In August of 1984, though, Murai would move to the Tokyo Institute of Technology, where he would consistently get his former student, Tsunohara, to bring him the research he accidentally left behind. But as Tsunohara started traveling back and forth more frequently, the trip became harder and harder. An idea brought upon by a magazine talking about modem phones sparked the idea of wireless connectivity between the two universities, making life much easier for Tsunohara. In October 1984, the connection was made between Keio University in Minato to the Tokyo Institute of Technology, not even 10 kilometers away in Meguro. In a newsletter in March of 2005, Hideki Tsunohara would go on to say, "A network does not just connect computers, but also connects the people behind them." Hideki Tsunohara could not have predicted what exactly would happen to the internet, but for the longest time, that was a rhetoric that was inseparable from the internet. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the technology would only gain some traction by the greater masses of Japan, first being adopted by the industrial sector and slowly being adopted for personal use. On the industrial side, the internet became a tool indispensable to business operations, streamlining the communication process as well as data sharing. On the personal front, the internet was an amazing way to talk to people that you couldn't normally speak to. Internet forums and very early forms of social media like Mixi and Gree were created with the intention of bringing people together by creating a digital town square. Nico Nico was the country's first video sharing platform, which connected people across the country by providing a means to communicate through video. As time went on, social media sites that dominated the West came to Japan. Things like Facebook and Twitter were taking over. Even through all of this development, the statement that Hideki Tsunohara made in 2005 still held strong. The internet was a means to connect people. But that wasn't its only functionality. Rather than connecting person to person, the internet also allowed for person to business connection. The natural progression of ordering a pizza through the phone is to order a pizza through the internet. As time went on, businesses started developing their online functionality, creating a new avenue for pre-existing services. Digital marketplaces made the process of buying things much easier. Now you no longer had to go to the store to get your odds and ends. While archiving data has been around forever, the internet allowed for that archive to be viewed by anyone, even being able to add to it on their own. Hatsune Miku was born, which is sick. But finally, and most notably, you could now watch anime, movies, TV shows, and adult films at any time, any place, as long as you had a connection. At what point were you ever required to go outside? Need food? Have it delivered. Want a new water bottle? Order it online. Are you bored? Stream a movie or play your favorite video game brought to you by a digital storefront. Feeling lonely? Text a friend, or better yet, sit in a digital town square as other people talk. Sit there long enough and you almost feel like you have company. Of course, the idea is that in a good society, these are just supplemental things that make life easier and more fun. And they do. In a good society, you have the time and money to meet up with friends, go out to actual movie theaters, and experience the joys of nature. The internet was just another avenue to do some of those things. Might not be the exact same, but it's a quick and easy way to get a bit of dopamine in between going out and living life. It shouldn't isolate you. It should connect you with the people behind the computer. But under the right circumstances, it can isolate you. Before it got its own characterization, Isekai was fantasy that combined the relatability of having a Earthborn main character and the craziness of a fantasy world. Like I said in the last section of this video, that is the main conflict of Isekai. Or at least it was, until 10 to 15 years ago where there was a sudden shift in the narratives in Isekai. The conflict that had been the main appeal and source of tension for Isekai narratives was slowly disappearing. The yin and yang nature between Earthborn protagonist and fantasy setting that was so prevalent in old Isekai started to homogenize. Protagonists were suddenly okay with the concept of leaving their lives behind and traveling to a new world. These new worlds were slowly starting to lose their prominent fantastical identity, becoming more Earth-like by the day. That is to say, apart from the accepted fantasy setting traits like magic and elves. These places were shifting to become less hostile, and even encroaching on the territory of appealing with their magic systems and relative simplicity. It had really attractive people, and the main characters got power they could never get in their other world. At the same time this was happening, another odd trend appeared in isekai anime, namely that they were killing a lot of their protagonists. Some, if not very few, new isekai have a story that is built around the idea of being transported to a new world. Most protagonists are now resurrected into it. Most commonly, they are hit by a truck on a side road, which popularized the term and pseudo-character truck-kun. If it was not a truck, it was usually an accident of some kind, something that could happen to anyone at most any time. Barely ever were these deaths caused by another person directly. In one of the 2 times I can remember it happening, no it didn't, and the other is an oddity among isekai. And while I said that only a few of those modern isekai are transportation-based isekai, there's usually something fishy with those which differ from that of old isekai. Most notably that there's usually no return plan. These characters are transported abruptly to this new world by some sort of magic or holy power that, unfortunately, cannot do the opposite, or it can, but the people who can won't. The main conflict that I thought was integral to isekai has now been cut off. The appeal of isekai was a return to normalcy, leaving behind the fantasy in favor of familiarity and comfortability. If that wasn't possible though, it was a story of struggling to find their own comfort amidst this unfamiliar and potentially dangerous world. As soon as you kill your main character, they can no longer return to the normal life that they've lived, because they're dead. But to a certain degree, I guess it still could be possible that tension still kinda not really exists even where shows where the protagonist dies. Which is the same in Transported There With No Return Plan isekai, where the tension of going home is always there, but is knowingly unachievable. Along with the increase of death in isekai also comes the increase in protagonists that seem to have no attachment to their own lives. In old isekai, you got to see the protagonist's life before the inevitable end of the episode where they are transported. In that time, you saw family, friends, relationships, pets. You could tell these people led happy lives, which made leaving them that much harder. In modern isekai, you don't see any of that. No, really, as isekai has been more focused on the death of its protagonist, the time it takes to transport into this new world has shortened. Instead of being at the end of the episode as a cliffhanger, the isekai happens immediately. Even those that aren't immediate show these main characters with very superficial lives. You don't see family, you don't get to see their friends. No part of their lives on Earth are documented. If any is, it's never positive. This shows the act of dying or being isekai'd as okay. It justifies the death of the protagonist by not giving the viewer any attachment to the characters' lives. The second you know there's a family or pet to return to, well, now you have a reason to go back, reason to fight. But that's not the goal of new isekai, is it? It wants you to feel like the death of its protagonist is okay, because the world they're in now isn't too bad, or they didn't have anything interesting on Earth anyways. It's okay, dear viewer, they're in a better place now. In fact, not only is their death okay, we should celebrate this as the thing they've always wanted. They wanted to escape their lives. They hated them anyways. There's better things to do in this new world. Their family is dead or absent, so it's okay. They can go create a new family in this world. People who were once bullied can become the center of attention for a gaggle of women that they would never be able to get in their previous lives. But also, do not think about your previous life right now. Don't. There are new magic systems to learn, new friends to make. Nothing bad ever happens in this world, and if it does, you can save it. It's fine if this character dies, it's fine if they hate their lives, it's fine if they're depressed. That makes being isekai'd all the better. It's fine, dear viewer. They're in a better place now. A fairly well-documented phenomenon in Japan is that of the Hikikomori, a group of people who, like the name suggests, have withdrawn from social participation. They have removed themselves from any activity that is required or heavily suggested for civilized life, like working a job or going to school. They often do not go outside, live with their parents until they are middle-aged or later, or live in small, cheap apartments that they do not pay the rent for. No one really knows the direct reasons as to why this group of people came to be this way. Sometimes it happens out of the blue. Sometimes there is a direct cause. Except, we do know how these people came to be. And it's entirely unsurprising that during the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a massive spike in hikikomori. Japanese culture is much different than the one we have in the West. We tend to have very hyper-individualistic attitudes towards the workforce and schooling, which has worked out great, no complaints. But Japan tends to balance very collective attitudes while also having extremely large expectations for its people. Japan has that saying about nails and hammers that does not need repeating, but also expects its own people to be the strongest, best nails they can be. This contradiction means that the Japanese people must fit into a very narrow set of social norms in order to be validated by the rest of the society. You are a worker or student before you are anything else, set with the expectation that you are going to be the best worker or student you can be. In this system, your existence is validated by your productivity or academic success. It is a pillar of self-identity because you have had expectations put on you by society that rewards productivity and academic success. That is not good. As this system goes on and more people are placing more expectations on future generations, the narrow set of social norms grows narrower. If your time, money, and energy is put towards appeasing the expectations of the company or school, you do not have the time to develop the self. You become a literal cog in the machine that is society. That is the process of alienation. It is in part a purposeful process created by corporations in the hope that the employees will become servile to the company, but can, and in this circumstance, has been brought on by rigid social norms. The employees become more dependent on the company to validate their existence, in turn becoming more productive and willing to generate wealth for the company, even at the expense of employee morale and health. It is a system that deliberately exploits its own people. But it's also a system that is very prone to break. The reliance on academic or professional success as a fundamental part of society only really works when there is direct access to either of those things. This system only works if there is an employer to validate the employee's existence. So when you lose access to employment, you lose the ability to be a human. If employment is validation and you aren't employed, you think of yourself and are seen as a failure of a human being. And what happens next? Well, if you have not met the expectations of society, you remove yourself from it. Whether done deliberately or by a sequence of events, people who are not being validated by the society around them tend to collapse in on themselves. They stop going to work or school, they don't look for employment or an education, they stop leaving the house, they lose access to safety nets, they become hikikomori. Of course, this means that becoming a hikikomori can happen at any time. You can just lose employment sometimes, or be bullied by other students to a point where you mentally collapse. But there can also be an impetus to this problem. Namely, say, a massive financial crash which would cost millions their jobs, force a stricter working environment, and expect students to be even more perfect than they were before. The financial crash was not just a strain on the economic conditions of the people of Japan. It also strained the already very strict social conditions of Japanese society. This was also at a time when something could facilitate the lifestyle of the hikikomori. The internet was the cherry on top that meant people could almost fully isolate themselves from society. As time has gone on, it has only gotten easier to live through a screen. And what do you do when you have all the time in the world? Well, you go to online chat rooms and social media, a place where people do not know that you are a failure. The layer of anonymity makes that interaction not feel quite real. If not that, well, you can order a pizza, I guess. But what you're most likely going to do is load up some entertainment. A movie, TV show, manga, anything really, as long as you're able to forget about everything going on around you. Something you can really escape to, and watch as someone fulfills the dreams you've always had, imagining you're in their place. Isekai, as we currently know it, has been around in anime for about 10 years, but upwards of 20 in other forms of entertainment. Within our current ecosystem, namely how fast culture moves, it is surprising to see an entire category of shows withstand the test of time. But of course it hasn't changed. Cultural moments as impactful and meaningful as Isekai do not just come and go with the flow of time. Isekai was born of something, and it will die from something as well. Neither the working conditions brought on by the asset price bubble bursting, nor Japan's strict social contract have gotten better. Economic stability is still unachievable for many individuals, especially those coming out of education and into unstable workforces. The requirement for social participation that could help people out of depression has been bottlenecked by financial instability as well as being replaced by the internet. These problems have not gotten better, and in many cases have gotten worse, and so Isekai will continue to stay trapped in the culture of Japan. As long as unhappy people exist, there will be a field of entertainment whose focus is on distracting them from their unhappiness. People who are happy with their lives do not need escaping from them. It's only until the underlying social conditions of the Japanese people are strengthened will people stop turning to forms of entertainment that appeal to their desire to escape. And I don't know what to do. Of course, I cannot change the social conditions of an entire country that I do not live in or even know the language of. That's unstable, Tobias. Any impact I have is dissipated into the online void before it can ever solidify into a movement of any kind. Plus, I kind of fear the power to do that anyways. But I think this video might help. Maybe. Change predominantly starts with education. If more people are cognizant of the issues with the genre of isekai, then maybe down the pipeline we make an impact somehow. That butterfly might be working overtime, but I do think it's important to start somewhere. To that point, I would greatly appreciate you taking the time to interact with this video in any capacity, namely liking and commenting, because it helps get the video out there. And if you haven't already, I would greatly appreciate your support by subscribing, or if you want a more direct way to support me, my Ko-Fi will be in the description. My name is Laszlo. Thank you for watching. See ya.